Thank you, everybody, for attending today's discussion on the key water definitions of NR 151, case studies and discussions from the field. My name is Landon Baumgartner. I'm a conservation specialist here with the Dane County Land Conservation Division. And this is the third installment of the NR 151 webinar series of 2022. We've so far dove into all the different portions of NR 151. We've discussed a little bit about some of the key definitions that guide interpretation of it. And now we're going to be focusing on specifically the water portions of it. We're lucky enough to have two main presenters today. We have Amy Piaget, County Conservationist from Dane County, presenting on variations of surface water in NR 151, what makes them unique and different, and how to kind of read in between those lines of the gray areas. We also have Aaron Hansen, the Door County Conservationist, presenting on variations of groundwater and how those interact with karst and shallow bedrock topographies. We unfortunately were not able to get one of the planned speakers to attend today's meeting to cover groundwater interactions with sandy topographies. So if you did attend today for that portion of the presentation specifically, we'd still love to have you stick around. But if you did come specifically for that, Aaron will try and touch on some of the insights into groundwater that may be reflective of concerns that you share, but we totally understand if you may want to bow out of today's presentation, maybe and attend a different one for sandy topographies at a later date, because that will not be a specific focus for today. Some housekeeping items for Zoom. Keep yourself muted during today's presentation, just so we can avoid any sort of background noise from interfering with today's presentation. You can do that by going to the little microphone icon in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and pressing on that to mute or unmute yourself. You'll have a chance to unmute in between the different portions of today's presentations when we will take questions from the audience, as well as at the end. I'll be able to tackle those at those times. While you are thinking of questions, feel free to throw those in the chat, either as the general chat discussion or go ahead and direct message them to me. I'll be going ahead and collecting all of those and then bringing questions to the floor at those intervals in between the presentations, as well as at the end. So we will have an opportunity to answer the questions that you have today. We're going to have plenty of time to tackle some of those and have some good discussion today, it sounds like. So to start us off today, we're going to have Mike Gilbertson, the Non-Point Source Program Coordinator with the Wisconsin DNR, leading us off with a quick reminder of where the topics we will discuss today are relevant to in NR 151, as well as remind us where previous presentations from this series can be found. So Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Landon, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, just wanted to, I guess, just a quick reminder and walk through where we can find the previous webinars that Landon mentioned. So going to, let me just bring up my, so if you go to the Wisconsin Land and Water webpage and you go to our work and you go to conservation training and you scroll down under on-demand webinars. So if you go into that and you view webinars, amongst many others that have been produced over the last few years, you can see all the different webinars, but you can scroll through and find the two other ones that we've done this year. So here's finding and defining, interpreting NR 151. So that's just a quick reminder of where this is at, where to find these. So you can reference that if needed. So to set this up and what to kind of expect for today, yeah, so we're kind of getting further into this dive into NR 151, and we have some case studies today that are going to try to tie together sort of the discussion of the complexities and the definitions of navigating 151, how to find them and how to use them, and some examples here that I think we'll see of today, and probably more. This is just some that I've put together, but for example, how complex, just an example of how complex it can be in finding what some of these performance standards actually mean. And for example, the clean water diversion as just kind of the extreme here of when you get into that performance standard and the topic of where do clean water diversions apply? So that that would be in a water quality management area. So that's just the first step of this. So then you go into 151 of the definitions and you find water quality management area. Then within that definition, you look at there are other terms used such as sites susceptible to groundwater contamination. Okay, so now you've got another layer, another term that you're looking for, looking to clarify as well. And so you look up that definition, and that references things such as direct conduits to groundwater, which now has another definition to work from. And so then within direct conduits to groundwater, there's more, that's defined as well, and that includes a term such as depressional groundwater recharge area. So, and you'll see this in the presentations, that reminders that there are two different areas within 151 of where some of these definitions exist. And as you work in 151 and you're kind of not sure what some of these terms mean, there's likely a definition in there. And just a reminder that looking at both sections of definitions is important so that none of these are missed, and you'll see how these are used, and that's the goal of today's presentation. So yeah, very fortunate to have two great conservationists with us today to present these case studies, and really looking forward to the conversation. So with that, I believe Amy is starting first, so I will turn it over to Amy Piaget from Dane County.
Good morning, everybody. Let me share a screen here. I hope. Okay. Hopefully everybody's seeing the intro slide here.
Looks good.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Amy Piaget. I'm the county conservationist for Dane County Land and Water Resources Department in our Land Conservation Division. And I'm going to touch on the definitions in NR 151, primarily related to surface waters in the code. Aaron will focus a little bit more on groundwater. So to kind of start, one of the things I did want to note is that while these definitions are in NR 151, there are a number of counties out there that also have incorporated NR 151 into their local ordinances. And I know in Dane County's case, our ordinance also has these definitions in it. So no matter what, we're working through these definitions, whether it's through NR 151 or through our own ordinance. So with that, there's a whole bunch of terms in NR 151 that just kind of, if you're like me, sometimes they're swirling around and you're not really sure which one applies, where they apply, how they apply, or even what they mean. So I'm going to start with some definitions of these terms, and then I've got some examples sites that that I'll walk through, not so much on the performance standard that the site was being evaluated for, but more on how we made a determination of the water resource that was being impacted. So with that, bear with me. These are going to be wordy slides here. So the first definition, and this is kind of the overarching one that I think most of the performance standards refer to, is waters of the state. So what are waters of the state? And these are defined actually in chapter 283 of the Wisconsin statutes. And it includes Michigan and Superior, those parts that are within Wisconsin, all lakes, bays, rivers, streams, springs, ponds, wells, impounding reservoirs, marshes, watercourses, drainage systems, and other surface water or groundwater within the state or under its jurisdiction. So pretty much anything that you can think of as water on the surface, it includes. Including, even though it doesn't explicitly call out wetlands, it does include wetlands in most cases as well. And these can be natural or artificial. So you can have ponds that are built, for example, there was a period of time when we had stormwater ponds that were built in line with navigable streams. So those would still be part of waters of the state. They can be public or private, except for those cases where they're entirely confined or retained on the property of a person. Best example that I've ever seen of one of those, and I don't have a picture of it, is some folks who have constructed like a pond on their property, and it is filled not through surface water runoff or natural groundwater, but they have like a well that they use to fill the pond, and it only gets water because of that. That's one example that I've seen where it's not really waters of the state, but still shows up sometimes. So surface water specifically is defined in NR 102 of Wisconsin administrative codes. And surface waters involve all the natural artificially named lakes or unnamed lakes in the state. It also includes all naturally flowing streams, but it doesn't include cooling lakes, which would be for things like power plants or things like that. It doesn't include farm ponds. So sometimes maybe we're putting a practice in place like a sediment basin or a wascob, and maybe water backs up behind that. That wouldn't necessarily be waters of the state or surface water. And then facilities that are constructed for the treatment of wastewater. So constructed wetlands for wastewater treatment wouldn't be part of the surface water definition. So there's a few other definitions that get pretty specific in NR 151 that refer to other codes as well. So ordinary high water marks, some of the standards, particularly the tillage standard, apply and address this kind of ordinary high water mark, and you need to kind of distinguish this. So it's the point on the bank or shore where the presence or action of surface water is continuous and leaves a distinctive mark. So, you know, it could be erosion that's showing where that ordinary high water mark is. It could be there's no vegetation, or there is vegetation or something else that makes it recognizable. Possibly, you know, riprap or rock or something of that nature. And that comes into play when we're talking about the top of channel. And the top of channel, again, falls within that tillage setback standard. And so that standard would apply at the top of the channel, which could be the ordinary high water mark. In steeper areas, so not all of the state, but in steeper areas, the 12% kind of continually for 50 feet, that's getting at those steep slopes along a stream corridor, and the top of channel may not be up until much further in the landscape. And then for those areas where it's less than 12%, the top of channel would still be the ordinary high water mark. So these are all nuances to navigate as you're looking through these standards. And just for an example, I've got here a stream. This red line kind of represents what I would say is the top of channel, but also the ordinary high water mark. And we don't have a steep slope leaving from here. So maybe the tillage setback would just be the 5 feet going from the ordinary high water mark out to this area. I didn't have a lot of great examples of steep slopes in Dane County along waterways, but this was one that I had. So here, that top of channel may be somewhere up here because we have a pretty steep slope along the stream where maybe the ordinary high water mark is down here at the bottom. So you have to kind of look at these and look at the slopes and kind of gauge in those standards where you think these definitions apply and where they actually apply in the landscape as well. Navigable waters are defined in Chapter 30 of Wisconsin statutes, and NR 151 references navigable waters. And the main thing I want to take away from navigable waters that really overlap a lot with our work that we do is that this kind of exception here where farm drainage ditches are not navigable unless there's some type of stream history. And usually in those cases, navigability determinations are done by the state through the Department of Natural Resources. In some cases, zoning through their shoreline zoning can also make some navigability determinations for shoreline zoning. But farm ditches are not always navigable, and that in areas that have had a lot of drainage can come into play. And I have some examples to show of that as well. The nutrient management standard refers to a lot of impaired waters, which basically show up on the 303D list on DNR's website. So I don't go into a lot of examples of these because you can look up the impaired waters for your county on DNR's website. But basically they're impaired for some water quality standard or specific substance or the designated use for that water body. The nutrient management standard also calls out outstanding resource waters, which are also available on the DNR website to be identified. But if you look in Wisconsin Administrative Code and NR 102, they actually call out all of the streams and segments that apply to an outstanding resource water. Exceptional resource waters are another one also defined in 102. A lot of those are trout streams throughout the state. And again, those are available on DNR's website. And those standards mostly apply, or those definitions mostly apply to the nutrient management standard. One of the big ones that we talk about are concentrated flow channels. This is identified in NR 151. And when Mike mentioned there's kind of two sections of NR 151 to look for definitions, there's two subchapters. There's subchapter 1, which addresses definitions for the entire code. And then there are subchapter 2, which is specific definitions for the agricultural performance standards. So you do have to make sure you look in both places when you're talking about some of this. But a concentrated flow channel is some type of natural channel or a constructed channel that's shaped and graded with dimensions with perennial vegetation. So that's a good example of grass waterways that we install on the landscape and in fields. It can also be a non-vegetated channel that's caused by ephemeral erosion. So that would be a gully potentially that's formed, but maybe we haven't come in and assisted with a grass waterway, or maybe a grass waterway isn't the appropriate practice for that. We see these in Dane County, usually in the driftless area with the ravines and the draws that come out of the hills down to the stream channels. Intermittent streams are also concentrated flow channels. Drainage ditches. So even though a farm ditch isn't necessarily navigable, it can be a concentrated flow channel. And that may also include road ditches in some cases. And then drainage areas that are identified on NRCS soil maps. You can usually kind of look for those. That's where I was kind of mentioning the draws through the valleys and the hills in the driftless area are sometimes shown as those kind of drainage ends. And the final definition I kind of want to walk through, because a lot of the performance standards reference this one, is the water quality management area. And these are the areas that are within certain setbacks of different types of water bodies. So the area within 1,000 feet from the ordinary high water mark of a navigable water that consists of a lake, pond, or flowage. So right away, you have to, as Mike was saying, go back and look at, okay, what's the ordinary high water mark and what is an navigable water? And is the water body that I'm looking at meeting all of those criteria in order to apply the 1,000-foot setback? And then, especially here in Dane County with the glacial activity that we've had historically, we have glacial pothole lakes as well. So I do have an example of this where it's 1,000 feet from the high water mark of that lake. The next one is more for streams, where streams or rivers, it's a 300-foot setback. Again, looking at the ordinary high water mark of the navigable waters. So a concentrated flow channel is typically not navigable. So you wouldn't have necessarily a 300-foot setback from a SWCMA for that, as an example. And then Aaron will get more into the sites that are susceptible to groundwater contamination or have the potential to be a direct conduit. But there are many areas where groundwater definitions are going to apply within the standards as well. So with that, I kind of want to move into some examples. And this picture is probably an easy one. It's a lake. And so if we have a resource there, this is Lake Mendota. It's a well-defined known lake. A lot of the cases are easy in that regard, where, you know, we have a large water body, it's known, it's named, and we can kind of apply those definitions to the performance standards relatively easy. But then there's all of the gray areas or the homework that we have to do to evaluate other sites. So in this particular example, there's a lot going on the screen, so I apologize for that. But in this example, we have a stream, which is this blue line that runs through here. That's Primrose Branch in Dane County. And then we have an intermittent stream, which is this stream coming in through here. And in this particular case, we were able to go out to the surface water data viewer and determine that navigability determinations had been done on this stream. So we know that this is navigable. And that's the homework we did in the background before going out to the site to address a performance standard. So in this particular case, we have, in this picture, we have livestock in the intermittent stream, and we're not maintaining bank stability through there. And then we also have them very close and within the 300 feet of the navigable portion of the stream. So the definitions here apply based on the performance standard that we're looking at, but also the types of water bodies that we're dealing with. Now, one of the things would also be, we have a water quality management area, and I don't have the border shown, but 300 feet from this navigable stream here is part of that water quality management area. So things within that are areas that we would be looking at for discharges. So another example, this one would be more of a concentrated flow channel with an intermittent stream. In this case, there was sediment erosion happening, and it was being discharged down at the bottom of the field. And the bottom of the field is also an intermittent stream. So all of these channels through here that you see are concentrated flow that have been stabilized with basically a grass waterway. So it's meeting that definition of a concentrated flow channel as far as it's conveying water through a shaped grassed channel. And in this case, those channels discharge down to an intermittent stream. This is another example where the intermittent stream is also in a large portion of this is also a grass waterway. So in this case, the intermittent stream was not navigable, but needed to be stabilized. So there is a grass waterway through here, and we had a discharge to it. And as you can see, we had material flowing through that grass waterway system down to another basically a navigable intermittent stream that was determined down here. So the case here is sometimes an intermittent stream can also be a grass waterway in some of our cases, and they both fall under the definition of a concentrated flow channel. So this example is kind of a complicated one and not obvious at first sight. So we were called out to a farm and did an assessment and determined that all the runoff from the farm kind of comes out to this one area over here and kind of ponds, as you can see. There's a tile inlet there. Here's our tile inlet. And so this area drains into a tile inlet. So then the question becomes, where does that tile inlet go? And how is that in relation to the definitions, a discharge from the standpoint of the performance standards? So in this picture off to my right, you can see the area where the material ponds through here. And just barely through this field, there are these small areas here, which are some inlet areas or breather pipes for the tile line. And we're able to follow this down to a discharge point down here, which this channel through here is the start of an intermittent stream. So in this case, it's not obvious that there was a connection between this farm and an intermittent stream or a stream in any case. We had to kind of do some investigation work in order to make a determination as to where this ponded water was actually flowing to. So it's, in this case, flowing through a drain tile, which is a pipe in essence, and then discharged into the intermittent stream. I mentioned before in Dane County, we have a lot of these glacial pothole lakes. So these are just some examples. They're internally drained areas. They don't have an outlet, so they don't flow anywhere. They may have, for example, like this one, they may have water that flow into them, but they have no outlet too. And these are examples. The black lines on these three maps are the watershed for that lake. So the water that falls within those black boundaries ends up going into this lake. Or for this one, the watershed kind of expands out because there are some intermittent streams that flow into it. And then this is kind of a long, narrow watershed for this lake here. The red lines that are on here are the 1,000-foot WICMA, water quality management area associated with it. And what we've done in some cases, particularly when we're looking at winter spreading of manure for farms that are maybe tight on land but still need some access, is we've looked at these maps and these watersheds and have made determinations as to whether or not the fields in question are actually draining to the lake or away from the lake. So one example might be up here, maybe we would allow an application within this area. It would involve us going out and doing a site visit as well. But we might allow application here just because it's not draining to this lake. Now, obviously, we don't have our 1,000 foots around these other lakes as well, but there might be an area within these drainage areas that we might allow manure applications, for example. This one here, the entire 1,000-foot water quality management area is within the watershed of that pothole lake. And so we would not, in that case, approve anything within that water quality management area. And then this one over here, similar, the watershed is kind of this long, narrow watershed, but we have areas outside, but we do have other water bodies that would have water quality management setbacks from them as well. So I think the important thing here is just because there's a line on a map, which is basically, we put a setback around these lakes, there's more to the landscape than just putting that 1,000-foot setback or that 300-foot setback from a stream to the lake or to a stream. When we're doing these interpretations, there's more to look at and a little more research that can be done to see how then the performance standards apply. This is an example of wetlands, and wetlands in my mind have always been kind of this gray area. They fall, in my experience, they fall kind of in the waters of the state definition, but they're kind of as all other waters under the state's jurisdiction, because that definition, if you remember, did not specifically state wetlands. But wetlands are regulated by the state, and the state does have jurisdiction over them. This is a case where we have some wetlands. They're mapped on the DNR surface water data viewer. These orange areas are mapped wetlands. So these are known to be wetlands. And in this case, we were evaluating this farm and they're having a discharge to the wetland. And so in our case, the performance standard would apply and they would not be meeting it because that wetland is there. There's a lot of questions too, I think, when you start getting into the pink layer, for example, of wetlands, which are the wetland indicators. And these are a lot of times based on the soil classes and whether or not there are water and wet indicators within those soils. These might take more investigation, and I may or may not call them waters of the state depending on what's there. In this case, it looks like a forested area is in there, so we may want to do some investigation to see, is that forested area really a wetland, or is it really just a forested area? But this area along here is cropped, so maybe we wouldn't call that a wetland or a problem from a resource concern standpoint. But they take some investigation and looking. The other thing that could be happening here is you have groundwater close to the surface. And Aaron maybe will get a little more into the depth to groundwater side of things, but that could be another component to this pink layer to think about, is that maybe it's not a surface water, maybe there's a groundwater connection there as well. So one other example, just to kind of walk through some drainage ditches and wetlands here. In this case, we've got a wetland complex that's mapped as a wetland complex. We've got an intermittent stream mapped through here, but you can tell it's probably been manipulated in the past because it's pretty straightened and squared off. Most streams don't flow that way. But then we also have these other channels coming off. You can see some historical lines through there and some remnants of that. And in this particular case, we would look at it from the standpoint of these dotted intermittent streams are drainage ditches, but they are waters of the state, because in these cases, we've had a navigability determination done where they are identified as being navigable. However, these ditches through here are not waters of the state because they don't have this history, or this, excuse me, they are waters of this. They're not waters of the state. They're concentrated flow channels through there. So these sites get kind of complicated when you're out there looking at them, because when you look at this channel through here compared to this channel, they're going to look exactly the same. But when you go back to your resources and map resources, there's going to be nuances that you have to look at the definitions and see which definition applies where. So in this case, waters of the state are these dotted blue lines. They're also navigable, but this farm drainage ditch is not navigable and not, and would be considered a concentrated flow channel. Complicated, we didn't necessarily have a resource concern here, but a good example of where all of this stuff overlays on top of a wetland area as well. So I think with that, those are my examples for today. Hopefully I didn't run through them too fast, but if there are questions, we can go back to things and go back and discuss some more too.
Thanks, Amy. That was great. We did have a couple come through. Mike has tackled some of the answers, but I'll just go ahead and read the couple of questions that we did get off to you as well, in case there's anything you'd like to add onto it as well. And then folks, go ahead and continue to add questions in as well whenever you get them, and I can go ahead and just keep on reading those. So the first one we got was from Dan. He asks, so a small lake entirely confined upon the property of a person is not a waters of the state, but a small wetland in the same situation is. And then Mike did respond saying that a small private constructed pond not connected to ground or surface water wouldn't be waters of the state. Gave an example of like small fish ponds. Would you agree with that, or have any critiques, additions, examples?
Yeah, so just because a naturally occurring water body is solely on private property, if you go back, sorry, I'm gonna make everybody sick scrolling. If you go back to waters of the state, public or private is included as part of that definition. So just because the small lake is wholly or solely on private property doesn't necessarily make it not a water of the state. But yeah, as Mike said, some of these kind of constructed ones where they're not connected to surface water and they're not connected to groundwater would fall under that exemption, where they're solely contained on a person's private property and they were constructed in some way. But some artificial ones, like I said, inline stormwater ponds, that would be an artificial water body, but it's connected to a natural system. I just lost my example. I did have an example, but I lost it. So,
But it goes back to that internal drainage part of it all. How does it
yeah,
drain?
there's a drainage component to it as well. Yep.
Okay.
I think one of the things we had people kind of joke at one point, well, if I build a pond on my property, then the farm has to stay 1,000 feet away from land application. And that's not necessarily the case. You can't just build a private pond that's not connected to any water and fill it up with water and say, well, now I have a pond and you have to stay 1,000 feet away. That's not the intent of these definitions there. So that would be a private pond that's artificial, but would be solely confined on the property and not connected to groundwater or surface water.
So neighbors cannot push their neighbors away by building a pond.
Generally.
Gotcha. All right. We did have one from Matt. Yeah, he says in his experience, the DNR has said they're no longer making navigability determinations. They would like to see zoning or land conservation staff make them. Seems like it could be a conflict of interest if the county are potentially writing permits or designing practices. Who should make navigability determinations? Mike did respond saying there is a web address in the chat box. To the DNR web page regarding waterway jurisdiction, which includes guidance on third-party determinations. So if anybody else has questions, that is in the chat box. And he also included a link to waterways programs to clarify who is responsible for making navigability determinations, including staff contacts. Amy, it sounds like from your examples, you had some experience with actually having navigability determinations done. What has been your experience?
The way we're operating currently, and we haven't made any changes there that I'm aware of, is if we have a project that has an intermittent stream or a stream identified on the surface water data viewer, usually provided information regarding our proposed project to DNR, to our water quality management specialist, our water reg and zoning specialist, and they have been at least not giving us formal navigability determinations with a formal letter or anything like that, but they've been looking through it and telling us yes or no, that's navigable. We have also looked, sometimes you can go on the surface water data viewer and you can see if a historic navigability determination has been made on a water body, and that's been helpful as well.
Yeah, man, I didn't mean to sound like I'm just pushing you off to a different program. It's just I don't know what the program's decisions is, and I know there's been some changes in their organization over the last few years and stuff. So I don't know what, I think there's probably a little bit of both going on. I think obviously with private projects, and, they talk about third party designations. And so I think there's guidance there that they provide for that, and that, our water reg and zoning specialists, just can't get to every project and make those determinations for everybody. But in a situation where we're talking about NR 151 related issues, compliance, non-compliance, and to help us determine where are the next steps for resolving these issues. Work with your ag non-points or your non-point source coordinator. They can get in touch with for those types of situations with the DNR or the appropriate DNR waterway staff, and then they would help make those determinations for those situations. Related to those kind of cases. But I don't think it's a blanket, just DNR isn't making determinations anymore. I don't think that's accurate. But I think with all the projects going on, I think there is some, there's a need for third party designations to be done, workload issues, and it's just something that a private project has to take on the cost of that determination. So again, don't mean to push you off there. It's just they will have a better answer for you on how to go about that. But also in the need of like I said, compliance related issues, don't hesitate to contact your the non-point source coordinator, and we can get into some determinations there with DNR staff. So hope that clarifies.
We've had an example of that where we did have a farm that had basically the stream running right through their barnyard. And we worked with a non-point coordinator who then pulled in the water reg and zoning person, and they did a full navigability determination, including bringing out their kayak and floating down the segment to document that it was navigable, because the site was potentially going to go into enforcement. And so we were looking at having that well documented. But we did work with the non-point coordinator, and then they brought in the chapter 30 folks to help us make those calls.
I'll just say here in La Crosse, that's Amy, it used to be that way. Whenever we needed assistance, we had assistance from the DNR, and that worked really well. But it's changed drastically in La Crosse. And so it's And our zoning department refuses to make the determination. So we kind of have an issue here in La Crosse. I think it's kind of at a point, it's at a boiling point, and we need to address it. I know Dane County is probably different. Every area is different, but it's an issue that we have to talk about. And Mike, we can talk about this tomorrow. And I just think we've got to figure out how to move forward. But I really see a conflict of interest in places. Like I mentioned, I don't want to bog the meeting down. We'll keep going, but it's an issue that we need to address.
Definitely need to have consistency, no doubt, Matt. Yeah, and if there's I'll be happy to bring it up to other people that that to address that concern, because yeah, like I said, consistency is definitely important and a goal of all of our programs.
This kind of goes along with what Amy was saying. Was somebody in the kayak for this test in your example, Amy? Was there a human weight added to it?
Oh, yeah.
All
Yep,
right.
they physically kayaked this little section.
All right.
So, and we had pictures of them in the kayak kayaking.
We have one asking the navigability resources mentioned in chapter 30 for permits and shoreline zoning. It says those navigability resources mentioned chapter 30 permits and shoreline zoning, but not who's responsible for determinations for NR 151. I'm assuming that goes back to Mike's answer earlier with your shoreline zoning or your zoning and water regs point of contact.
Yeah, we have relied, at least like I said, in Dane County, we're working on an understanding with our water reg and zoning staff person that covers Dane County, and we have an agreement on how we're doing kind of these, I would say they're unofficial navigability determinations, in the sense that there isn't like a docket number and there isn't a formal letter sent. I know DNR has done that in the past, but these don't have formal letters. They're just, we're pitching project ideas, trying to address erosion or different things. And these dotted lines or blue lines on the map show up, and we're looking at, are these navigable or not? But we are looking at them from the standpoint of not so much just 151 compliance, but if we want to install a conservation practice to address a resource concern, we're looking at it as to whether or not we need a permit to do that as well. So I think there's an overlap there. We're not just looking at a navigability determination for a 151 compliance determination. We're also looking at it from the standpoint of a resource concern that we need to address, and do we or don't we need a permit to do the practice that we're proposing.
Mm-hmm.
We're at the same place in La Crosse now, Amy, also, and that's why this is such an important issue right now.
Exactly. It is a huge issue. And one that I do think, from the association standpoint, we could probably work with the agency on coming up with some guidance.
Something a little bit more informal and a little bit less in-depth, mapping resources. Is there a preferred GIS resource for determining what waterways fall under NR 151 from a desk, SNAP, surface water data viewer? Seems like they all align pretty consistently from my experience. Do you have a preference, Mike or Amy?
I use the surface water data viewer, I believe that data is available because our county has taken that data then and includes it in our own version of a GIS viewer. But it comes originally from the DNR. I think in Dane County, at least, we have, because of our shoreline zoning requirements, there have been updates to some of that with some additional clarification. So we might look at both because they may have identified areas that are navigable or things like that that are updated on our layer, but not updated yet on maybe the state layer.
In my experience using SNAP, SNAP seems to have a WICMA boundary around all perennial streams, but it excludes intermittent streams from my experience. So it seems to treat those as a very hard line difference, which from our discussion today does not seem to be necessarily the case, though I wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, and I would just say, you know, I would, how, at DNR, yes, we'd probably rely on the surface water data viewer first as just kind of a first cut, is to see what's out there as we're responding to, you know, somewhere of concern. And that's really the extent of how we'd use that. You know, you can probably glean a lot out of, yeah, that's a pretty obvious stream or river that is navigable just from the 24K hydro layer. There may be, you know, those are the pretty obvious ones. It might show up as a intermittent stream or something that may be into question whether it's navigable or not, or it may not even show any sort of channel or anything on the 24K hydro, and so it's a first step. But I mean, if you're getting into those gray area, the ones that are hard to determine, especially like I said, if we're talking about an NR 151 compliance related issue, you know, to help guide where the next steps of addressing that goes, you know, internally or whatever, you know, that's where I think, you know, the need to reach out and have somebody do that determination, like floating a kayak down a stream through a manure or through a feedlot. Those kinds of things would come into play. So yes, I would say surface water data viewer is probably the main one we would use. But like I said, it's the first cut, and only if it's clearly obvious would we probably make a determination from that. But definitely have to go further if in those smaller gray area ones.
Sure.
Yeah, the other thing too, you mentioned kind of SNAP Plus and where the intermittent streams don't show up. That's related not so much to NR 151, but specifically to the 590 nutrient management standards. So there are also nuances associated with the technical standards that we work with that are not necessarily the same as the definitions or the standards that are in NR 151.
Yeah, so I guess that I would answer, I guess we're answering that question with SNAP was applicable to specifically the 590 portion of NR 151, but not necessarily the rest of it. The rest of it, something like surface water data viewer would be more appropriate as a starting point. So that sounds about right from my experience.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, an intermittent stream in 590 would be a concentrated flow channel, more so than having the SWCMA setback.
Right, in 590. I did have one question historically, not through this chat, but somebody did ask me, and this seems like a great time for other folks who may come into similar situations, especially in the driftless area, where you sometimes have a 1 to 2 slope, a 45-degree slope between a barnyard and a possibly navigable stream below it. That is the difference between, as the crow flies, the water could be 150 feet away from a pollutant source, but as the water flows, could be a little bit over 300 feet based on the difference in the topography of the area. So is it 300 feet as the crow flies or 300 feet as the water flows? If you've ever gotten a question like that.
I think that gets back to your ordinary high water mark and top of channel kind of definitions based on the different standards. So there is that component for top of channel associated with slope that may play into those cases. And then there is that ordinary high water mark, which may be something to consider as you're looking at that. But I think, if I remember correctly, the water quality management areas here are all from that ordinary high water mark.
Okay. I don't see any more questions coming in for this section right now. I'll keep an eye out in case there's anything. If anybody's forgotten anything, continue to go ahead and add those in, and I can bring those up at the end.
Hey, Landon.
Oh, yes, sir.
And I just wanted to clarify too to Katie's question. Yeah, I didn't mean to, those links weren't intended to say who's exactly responsible. That's my point, is that that's the program that would give you the information on who would be responsible for making those jurisdiction determinations, and those contacts. But that's just a start. Obviously, we can we can clarify that, or assistance needed with, contacting your local non-point source coordinator as well. So sorry for any confusion there.
Thank you, Mike. And I think we're ready for Aaron's portion of the presentation on to groundwater. So I will go ahead and pass it along to Aaron.
Morning, everybody. I'm Erin Hansen, Door County Conservationist, and Penny is going to bring up a presentation for me. So just while we're waiting for that, thank you, Penny. I really was going to address groundwater from the perspective of working in Door County in a karst and shallow bedrock area. Some of the definitions that we have here, of course, are going to be relevant to other parts of the state, but I really do understand that you have different concerns, perhaps, and perspectives that can vary greatly depending on where you are. So just keep in mind when I'm talking here, I'm specifically dealing with the experiences that we've had here in Door County. And to conserve bandwidth, I am going to turn my video off, but I'll come back at the end. Okay, so let's see. We can move to the next slide, please. Great. Mike and Amy already talked about this, but I really did want to highlight that when you're looking at NR 151, there are two subchapters to look for definitions. And I'm going to talk about 4 definitions primarily today. The first being direct conduits to groundwater, which certainly is one of the most important definitions that's listed in subchapter 1 under the general provisions. Moving on to subchapter 2, we also, if we can move to the next slide, please. We also have closed depression, water quality management area, and sites susceptible to groundwater contamination contained within the definitions of subchapter 2. So those are the 4 primary ones that I'll touch on today. And Amy was good to note that when you're working with your local ordinance, you will also have definitions contained within those. Since we're approaching this from a statewide perspective, I've kept it to NR 151. That's our goal here today. I've also built in along the way a couple of examples of how the definitions fit together in a practical way. So let's move on to the first one. Direct conduits to groundwater. So here we have listed 9 components that together comprise the generic direct conduits to groundwater. So including this definition, you can find direct conduits to groundwater referenced in about 8 locations in NR 151. It's in the definitions of closed depressions and sites susceptible to groundwater contamination. In 2 of the performance standards, both the process wastewater performance standard and solarium bedrock standard, and also a reference in one of the non-ag performance standards. But when we look at direct conduits to groundwater, really we're looking at places where there can be a connection between the land surface and groundwater, such as wells, sinkholes, swallets, fractured bedrock at the surface, a variety of mining applications, tile inlets discharging to groundwater, or the depressional groundwater recharge areas over shallow fractured rock. If we could advance, please. So here are a couple of photos. I'll move from the left to the right across the top. Most of us know what a well looks like from our own yards and if you're living in a rural area, homeowners well. I think it's important to remember too, of course, that we've got wells that may no longer be in use in fields that are easily hidden by vegetation. So in the upper left, we have an example of a well. Moving To the right, we have an example of a sinkhole. Come in all shapes and sizes. In Door County, they don't exist in isolation. In this particular field, staff mapped dozens when they were asked by the farm to take a closer look for potential manure applications earlier this spring. Obviously, this was not a good field for manure applications. The next on the upper right, here in this photo, what you can see in the foreground is a road culvert where there's surface water flow traveling under the road across the field to a hole in the ground. So this would be an example of a small swallet, which is a place where surface or stormwater drainage disappears underground. On the bottom left, we have fractured bedrock at the ground surface. This is immediately adjacent to a crop field. This one's pretty well visible, but there are other locations where not so much. And on the bottom right, I have an image of a tile inlet. This one you can't see where it's discharging. Direct conduits to groundwater, the definition does include tile inlet discharging to groundwater. I use my phone a friend lifeline just to get a better perspective on this one. It's not one that we encounter very often, but essentially it's where drain tile outlets into a sinkhole or into a well. And apparently discharging to a well was a common idea in the pre-1930s in the upper Midwest, as there wasn't a way to do a pump station when there wasn't a good surface outlet nearby. These are not considered legitimate ways of outletting tile lines, and there's very few that are actually operational, but they are out there. And I think a good reminder to be, as Amy was talking about tiles, investigating where the discharge that enters a tile inlet, where it ends up. Let's move on to the next slide. Also included within the definition of conduit to groundwater, we have the depressional groundwater recharge areas over shallow fractured bedrock. And this definition is quite broad compared to the one we'll look at next for closed depression. And it can be interpreted on different scales. Here I have an example of a field. It's not used for manure applications, but same conditions also exist at livestock sites with other potential contaminant sources that can be considered. So understanding where you are in the landscape certainly is important in this aspect. So just to orient you to what you're seeing, the purple solid lines are 5-foot contours, and the fainter yellow lines are 1-foot contours. And then we have some dashed lines on the lower left. You can see a dashed area. This is about an acre in size. And on the right-hand side, on the lower portion of the screen, you can see a dashed purple area. This was about a 1/4 acre of size. And the underlying soil that we have here is a long grade loam, a well-drained loam soil underlain by dolomite bedrock at about 20 to 40 inches. So this would be an example of a depressional groundwater recharge area over shallow fractured bedrock. We'll move on to the next slide where we have a more narrow definition of a closed depression than what we just looked at. This definition was added to NR 151 at the time the slurry bedrock standards were created, those standards that are targeted performance standards for eastern Wisconsin in shallow bedrock areas. And its closed depression is mentioned specifically in that solarium bedrock standard, and that's where its primary focus is in. It's in 2 locations there where it prohibits surface manure applications within certain distances of closed depressions. So here I highlighted in red, really the definition focuses on a basin where water ponds to a seasonal high water mark, has no external drainage, and the drainage may occur either through a direct conduit to groundwater or simply a low area where water ponds and then infiltrates into groundwater. And the definition further goes on to discuss ways that you may be able to identify where a closed depression is. It gives you an indication of how you might identify these closed depressions. So if we could advance to the next slide, please. So one of the ways is to use ArcGIS tools or other methods. In Door County, like some other counties in the state, contracted creation of a closed depression layer using our recent LiDAR data. It also combines a culvert inventory and a hydro-enforced digital elevation model. And so essentially this creates a county-wide layer that's hosted in an online viewer and also a shapefile for staff use. Again, it's always important to recognize when you have something that's created through a digital process that's surface, actually going to the site and verifying the conditions on the ground is important, but it's one tool that we can use to point us to where closed depressions can exist. I didn't create this image. I got to give credit to Brian in our office here, who really used this as an example to show the purple or pink boundaries of the closed depression that's been mapped. The deeper color shading indicates depth. So you could see that there's a darker purple on the lower left and a conduit to groundwater that's mapped. This is a well-known feature in Door County. So we didn't need necessarily a GIS analysis to point us to this feature, but it's a good example of one of the tools that we've used to identify closed depressions. We can look at what it looks like on the land surface when we advance to the next slide. And this photo is an on-the-ground view from March of 2010, but many springs, each spring it's going to look this way when surface flow fills the depression and it hasn't yet drained. And we can advance to see what it looks like in September. So this is about the same area, looking at the same feature. The vegetation difference is still visible. Surface flow into the features drains through the conduit to groundwater, and ultimately it comes to the ground surface again at a spring a distance away. Next slide, please. I use this for a reason, because beyond illustrating a closed depression, I thought it was really important to remind ourselves that we shouldn't just look at large features in isolation, but really we need to understand the landscape and the context that they are in. And so the image on the left is the same area as what you saw earlier with the closed depression in the purple. But this map also shows you exposed bedrock with blue dots and sinkholes with red. And the white around the edge is a 150-foot buffer. The purpose of creating this was to talk with the landowner about a rolling portion of this field in crop. And on the right, you can see an example of one of those red dot sinkholes. Small, barely visible. We know that the map on the left doesn't show all of them. It wouldn't be possible to map all of them. And our approach here is not to identify, okay, well, there's certain portions of this field that may be appropriate for manure application. That's not it. But rather to identify that this area is very high risk for contaminants on the ground surface to reach groundwater. Next slide. Okay, we're going to transition to a different definition. Amy already touched on water quality management area, or WQMA. I highlight in blue here the portion that's appropriate that refers to groundwater. And here we have reference to a site that is susceptible to groundwater contamination or potential to be a direct conduit for contamination to reach groundwater. And that brings us to the fourth definition, if we could advance to the next slide, related to site that is susceptible to groundwater contamination. So here we have the definition for WCMA. And if you dig down further, you can find another section of NR 151 that talks about site that's susceptible to groundwater contamination. So let's take a look at that definition. Here we have 6 paragraphs that describe sites based on their proximity to wells, conduits to groundwater, and soil characteristics where there is shallow bedrock or groundwater. So site that is susceptible to groundwater contamination includes an area within 250 feet of a private well or 1,000 feet from a municipal well. Upslope, greater distance, and 100 feet downslope of a direct conduit to groundwater, which we already looked at that definition. A channel that's flowing to a direct conduit to groundwater. An area where we have less than 2 feet of soil to groundwater or bedrock. And then this last paragraph, F, talks about varying characteristics of fines related to the amount of soil that's present between the ground surface and the sensitive feature, whether it be groundwater or bedrock. If we move to the next, we'll see that NR 151 really even defines percent fines for us in, again, that first section of NR 151. The idea being here that fines are the component in the soil that slows water transport. So if you have a greater amount of fines, you can have a shallower amount of soil and not be a site that's susceptible to groundwater contamination. So really a lot of homework necessary to identify whether you're falling within this paragraph F. Let's move on. So now that we've looked at the definitions, we'll use an example to show how they can fit all together. This photo is an unconfined manure pile at a small operation in Door County. Doesn't have manure storage, certainly not the largest. Size varies though throughout the year based on how many animals they have as well. And I can also note that NR 151 also provides you with a definition for an unconfined manure pile if you need that. So for this example, I was just going to work through 2 of the manure management prohibitions. The first being a livestock operation shall have no unconfined manure pile in a water quality management area. So let's move on to that one. So if we'll remember, we have water quality management area, which is defined. Included within water quality management area is a site that is susceptible to groundwater contamination, which sends us to another definition that we can pull from whether or not we're in the area within 250 feet of a private well. In this example, we had a private well and then concern about shallow bedrock within that area. So when we're looking at a specific performance standard, it's really important to dig down through the layers of the definitions to ensure that we're considering all of the appropriate pieces. Water quality management area, my initial thought was surface water, but of course we need to be mindful of sites that are susceptible to groundwater contamination as well. So following these definitions, in this example, the site was not meeting the prohibition, and we'll move on to the next one, in which we have a requirement that there be no direct runoff from a feedlot or stored manure into waters of the state. And as Amy pointed out, of course, we have groundwater is waters of the state. We also have a definition for direct runoff that we can refer to. One of the paragraphs in that refers to discharge of a significant amount of pollutants to a direct conduit to groundwater. And we can refer back to our definition of direct conduit to groundwater. In this, I believe now I'm into a fictional example, but should runoff from this unconfined manure pile surface flow across to an area, for example, with fractured bedrock at the ground surface, this would also be not meeting that prohibition. So I think the the purpose here is just to show how all of the definitions fit together. You know, most of us are problem solvers and we immediately want to jump straight to the solution. You know, what's the better place to stack the manure? Is storage needed? But here I'm just illustrating how to approach a compliance determination, you know, working standard by standard through each of those definitions that are given to us in NR 151. So our key takeaways, we've hit on it a couple of times now, but early in my career when I was working with the code, I did have a stumbling block remembering to check both subchapter 1 and 2 of NR 151 for definitions. That's easily resolved. And of course, if your local ordinance is what you're working with, you're going to look to your ordinance for what your definitions are there, but just know that these are available in NR 151. Like everything we do, we've got to keep the larger context of the landscape we're in as kind of the big picture that's in our mind. Knowing what's relevant in Door County might be less important for your area, but you know, we don't have our next presenter who was going to talk about the sandy and highly permeable soils. He would have offered a different perspective, but I think that this point still applies wherever you are in the state. Just everything we do, of course, you know, just know where we are and keeping that bigger picture in mind. And the third was to follow the chain of definitions right all the way to the end. I think it's really helpful to pull out code or ordinance each time we're making those determinations, because depending on the site conditions, I still find new applications of those definitions that are specific to a site that maybe we haven't encountered before. So just following that, I called it a pathway, following that to the end. And so those were the 3 points that I wanted to bring forward today. I would be happy to answer any questions if there are some.
Thanks, Aaron. It's always good to have reminders, no matter how long you've worked with code. You can sometimes learn something new just looking at it from a different perspective every time, it seems like. So we have only one question in the chat right now. Again, feel free to continue adding those in. We did have one from Tyler, who asked, would an internally drained depression in pitted sandy outwash meet the definition, it sounds like, of that closed depression for sites susceptible to groundwater? He put 20 to 30. I think you meant inches, not feet to groundwater, Tyler, if I'm reading that correctly. If you want to elaborate a little bit more, feel free to unmute. But he was asking if that fell into that initial definition you talked about during your presentation. Oh, it is feet. Oh, okay.
So everybody's interpretation of what shallow rock is going to be different. And so I think that that's what the question is driving towards, is it not?
Yeah.
Remind me of the question.
Yeah, he said would it, it's in the chat box to everybody as well, so you can kind of read it if it helps a little bit as well.
20 to 30 feet to groundwater.
I think the question was more related to the soil type. No bedrock involved, he says. So this would be sort of something that would have been better addressed, I guess, from somebody with more experience in the sandy soils. But
I'll go with that.
Yeah, if anybody,
If we can crowdsource the answer to that from people
absolutely.
who are here, feel free to add to the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if anybody has a better answer to that, feel free to type it in or unmute and answer that one as well. I'm not that familiar with sandy soils as well either.
I was just going to say, and it brings up another issue. How does it relate to the setbacks in regards to groundwater susceptibility in the 590 standard? And should we be looking at that standard, and or when should we look at 151 versus the 590 standard? And I guess I haven't looked at them in a while, but I was going to ask you, Aaron, are they consistent? Maybe you've looked at them recently in regards to the definition of susceptibility to groundwater, and when do we differentiate and use one or the other?
I did not, in preparation for this discussion, I did not cross-reference what the definitions were in 590 relative to what they are in NR 151. My initial response is when we're looking at the nutrient management standard, that's when I would look to 590 as the technical standard for the nutrient management performance standard. And so I would be specifically looking there for that aspect. Though that said, there could be supporting pieces of evidence within that 590 standard that you might want to bring forward as you're looking to NR 151 compliance determinations. But when I'm thinking about the performance standards, the agricultural performance standards and prohibitions, explicitly, I'm going to be looking to those definitions within NR 151.
Mike, do you have more to add to that? To either of these? Oh, I see you may have added. Oh no, somebody else added something in the chat.
No, just more into Tyler's question. I guess I'd probably get into asking, is this related? What is that related to? And maybe with all the different areas of code that maybe it's not specifically about the shallow depth or shallow depth to bedrock or groundwater. Maybe there's a different area there that we could pursue within that issue that may be more clear about, an avenue to address the situation with that landowner. But without, knowing more about this situation, yeah, it's hard. I mean, if there's no bedrock there, I think it clearly said there that the depressional groundwater recharge area over shallow bedrock.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that specific situation would apply there, but not to say there's something else within, again, the complexities of this code that may allow some avenue of hey, we got to do something different out there. So not really a great answer, but I would say we need to dig into that one a little further.
Andrew asks, did the entire field within the closed depression, so this is going back to you, Aaron, did the entire field with the closed depression, the purple pink areas you showed, contain, or was it underlain by shallow fractured bedrock?
The areas where the depressions were identified were, again, that was just an example I was using to make a point, and so I didn't go broader than that to look. There's probably some transition in a large field between, depending on where it is in the county, between the very shallowest soils. But for the purposes of looking for that depressional groundwater recharge area over shallow rock, I looked specifically in the depression area that we had mapped.
There is a comment added in here. I think it's worth reiterating. Maureen says she thinks the closed depression terminology was added to 151 specifically when the Silurian standards were written, but it's always good to think about where the water is going and whether it has the potential to contaminate groundwater. Would you agree with that, Mike, from your experience too?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly where that definition was added in 2018 when the Silurian bedrock performance standards were promulgated in the code. But yeah, always a good reminder there. Good point, Maureen. And yeah, it's all these things, especially when it gets, whether it's a good idea to be going somewhere with manure and nutrients and potential impacts to groundwater in general. But then, yeah, as we're specifically talking about what are the next steps of correcting a situation like that, I mean, that's where the complexities of looking at the code and what's the appropriate standard that we can point to, so that we have an ability to address these situations. But yeah, always a good point there, just in general, what's going on out there, whether it's stated specifically in code or not, kind of the common sense and idea there. So thanks, Maureen.
Yeah, I'll just add it in my experience, even if there's not a code prohibiting applications in a certain area based on whether or not it's permeable or shallow to bedrock, there's usually some sort of optimal timing aspect involved with all those somehow. When, if you're going to go there, is best. So that's just my experience. Amy, if you want to jump in, I don't know if you have anything to add to any of these questions. I know that we've been kind of dominating this part, but if you wanted to add anything, I didn't want to leave you out on those as well. I saw that you had put in a comment about French drains, if that's a term. I'm assuming that was the term used to define or to talk about tile inlets outletting into a well.
That was a historic term. Sometimes like you'll talk to a farmer or something and they'll be like, oh, the French drain that, was put in, as Aaron noted, a long time ago. Some of those would be examples. I think getting back to Tyler's question, you have to look at the depths, and he was noting, that definition, and the other presenter isn't here, but you'd be probably looking at the site susceptible to groundwater contamination and trying to see how your closed depression fits within, not your closed depression, but your depressional area fits within that definition. With the areas, as Aaron mentioned, about the fines, percent fines and depth over bedrock or groundwater.
Okay. Any other questions on the topics that we have touched on today? I apologize again. We'll try and get a topic for those in the central sands areas and other areas where those sandy topographies are going to have a lot more nuance to them. We'll probably address those at a future event. But for now, there will be an evaluation sent after this presentation today, which includes a survey for folks to respond in regards to topics of discussion for the next installment of this webinar series. We're going to be touching on pollutant sources in a very similar format, most likely to what we did today. Since we've touched on various types of waters on Wisconsin farms, now we're going to be delving into the pollutant sources themselves. Since you all today are amongst the most engaged in these topics, we want to hear from you and to know if you have any insight or expertise to offer in the development of that next meeting. So we will be able to get in touch with you after that, but we'll give everybody some time to respond and see who we can kind of garner to hopefully have a very similar presentation to what we did today, where we have folks who are boots on the ground and have a lot of these great examples to kind of guide us in some of these definitions. So if you have any follow-up questions, I will put my information in the chat box and feel free to send them my way. I definitely want this to be something that people feel comfortable following up on, since there was a lot of information packed into this conversation today, and I can definitely hopefully pass that along to folks who would be able to answer that kind of most thoroughly. So I'll go ahead and put my information in the chat. Okay. Other than that, I believe that we are done with today's presentation. I'll stick around for a few more minutes along with Penny to kind of close things out. If anybody has anything else they'd like to add, but I think we've touched on all of the chat questions. If anybody wants to unmute now and kind of run something by the folks who are around, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll be in touch yet probably hopefully this summer for the next installment, part 4. It will be coming up. So we'll keep this going.